What's up, Rovers? Invitations from Raguna have arrived. We're finally off to Rinascita in version 2.0. Hope you all had a good Christmas and New Year's and holidays, as it's now time to step into the newest region of Wuwa. And with the new region comes new resonators. The first to greet us is none other than Lady Carlotta herself, the youngest of the Montelli family. She is a glacial pistol user, being the first of each in the limited character roster. She has insane DPS potential, and rumors have it, she can even out-damage Jinhsi. Wanna know more? Don't worry, I got you. Today's guide has taken over 50 hours as usual to make, and if you found this video useful, feel free to leave a like or a subscribe. As a reminder, full team breakdowns have been moved to a separate video follow-up. This guide will still mention her best teammates and how the teams play, but nuances on gearing and rotations will be saved for the next video. We'll cover Carlotta's team role and main mechanics first, then the typical deeper dive. Forte Priorities come after, and then echo stuff. Mainstats, Substats, and our new Glacio Echo set compares to existing options. Then we have weapon comparisons, endgame stat goals, and our sequences breakdown. The last bit includes our rotations and then a short summary of our team setups. Let's dive right in. Want to know what the feistiest child of the Montelli family can do? She wields guns and more guns, and for her ult, pulls out a giant gun that upgrades into, you guessed it, an even bigger gun. Understandably, Carlotta brings massive firepower to the table. Her main role is a Hypercarry, but is quite Quickswap friendly before her backloaded rotation section, because the Quickswap moves have extremely long cast times, and some of the longest in the entire game. This means we have gained another good dual carry unit that Quickswaps just as well as Yao or Changli. She also has the fastest full rotation times of any DPS so far, clocking in at just 12 seconds, and below 10 seconds of field time required for Quickswap teams. As a result, Carlotta is currently the strongest DPS in the game, but note that her main damage is split up across the back half of her rotation rather than concentrated in singular hits. Her drawbacks? She is only about 5% stronger than Jinhsi at best and is almost entirely single target. Granted, bosses are the hardest part of Wuwa anyways, but to help do her job better, she has generous crowd control, iframes, hyper armor, mobility, range auto targeting that can't really miss, and token AoE tools. She also carries massive 80% final damage stealth buffs for her main DPS sources, but they will be lost on swap out. Luckily, this backloaded DPS window requires even less field hogging time than Camellia. So how does Carlotta work? She has two main phases, pre-liberation and post-liberation. Everything before her liberation is her prep phase, and liberation is her big DPS phase. She has high mobility in both halves, easily maneuvering the battlefield around enemies or even up in the air. She requires more effort to play than Camellia at a baseline, but I wouldn't consider her a complex character like Changli. She's much more like Jinhsi, where you understand the mechanics and do the appropriate actions to skip optional sources of setting up. Once again, intro is extremely important for Carlotta, as it is worth half her Forte bar in actual Forte energy production, whatever stacks used to convert into her Forte bar. Otherwise, Forte is normally generated with basic attacks and skill casts. So why is her Forte bar so important? Filling it instantly grants 80% final damage to her entire liberation rotation. This buff is granted on reaching full Forte and cannot be removed in any way until your liberation ends or you swap off during your liberation. You should be casting her full Forte heavy anyways, because it is one of her few sources of AoE damage, and it still hits pretty hard. Once you cast her liberation, you just spam 4 big shots, then cast a second liberation. Yes, she has 2. Her second liberation is her final big hit before she leaves the field. Make sure to cast her skill twice before you outro, and I'll explain why later. Let's look at Forte Priorities next. The vast majority of her damage comes from her liberation, so you absolutely want to level that first. Note that it is still considered skill damage, which is why her pie chart looks like this. Roughly 85% skill damage no matter what weapon you use. All of her big shots post-liberation and the second liberation all come from this tree. The second priority will be her skill tree. Why? Because it has 2 casts in succession, similar to, say, Yinlin's skill mechanic. But not only that, you actually use the double cast twice per rotation, before she ults and after she ults, and it also hits super hard. This is not only optimal for faster rotations and better Forte generation, but also optimal damage, whereas you only get to cast her fancy AoE Forte Circuit heavy once per rotation. Thus, Skill Tree is second and Forte Circuit is third. Intro and basic attack trees are not important in normal scenarios. If you choose to use solo Carlotta gameplay though, I would recommend leveling her basic tree a bit more, as her skill, Forte, and Liberation will have downtime. For inherent skills, they are extremely important. Get them as soon as you can. The first gives true hyper armor and iframes during her aerial skill, which is a vital part of her rotation. While the hyper armor and iframes don't matter for Quickswap, it is very useful for those playing traditional Hypercarry. Her second inherent skill allows her to apply her defense ignore debuff from almost all parts of her kit, instead of just her initial liberation cast. It's an 18% defense ignore debuff. You want it. She deals a lot of damage even outside of her liberation, and without this, her final biggest hit from her liberation can be missing this debuff. Still lost on how her Forte circuit works? No worries, let's dig a little deeper. As we said earlier, Carlotta needs to reach a full Forte bar to grant a big self buff, because without it, your entire liberation rotation will be missing the 80% final damage multiplier. Once you reach full bar, feel free to heavy attack to use it. The liberation buff sticks around until your liberation ends, or you swap off during her liberation. Her Forte circuit consists of two systems, molding crystals and substance. Substance is her actual Forte bar, holding up to 120. And molding crystals are these floating crystal things left over a playable model holding up to max 6 at a time. Certain moves build molding crystals, and certain moves burn them to convert into substance. The only way to get substance directly is with her intro skill or her S1. Therefore, you want to find the fastest ways to produce and burn molding crystals to fill the rest of her substance bar. Using 2 basic attacks builds 3 molding crystals worth 10 substance each. Having molding crystals changes her basic attack to consume them 1 at a time per attack. This is the slowest way to produce substance and is never used outside of solo play or overworld. A single heavy attack also produces 3 molding crystals, which can be burned with the special basic attacks as well. An even faster way to produce molding crystals with higher damage is to cast her first skill. This instantly produces 3 molding crystals and enables her second skill. Casting that consumes all molding crystals present to convert into substance, while doing a fancy big damage aerial move. So if you heavy attack and cast skill, you have 6 crystals, which casting skill again will burn all of it for 60 substance. This is also why our intro is so important, because it both generates 30 substance and 3 molding crystals instantly. Finally comes the other mechanic of her Forte circuit, Tinted Crystal. This is a buff that recharges every 22 seconds and waits for you to use it. You can tell by the color of the crystal in her Forte bar. Blue means inactive, pink means Tinted Crystal is active. Whenever it's active, casting a full Forte bar heavy will use the special AoE move, Imminent Oblivion, instead of the ordinary containment tactics. There's absolutely zero difference in mechanics here, except just a fancy move with bigger damage in AoE. More importantly, both versions of her full Forte heavy attack will reduce your skill cooldown by 6 seconds. Tinted Crystal has a 22 seconds cooldown when used before it returns, and she operates on a 25 seconds ult timer for the team. So in practice, you'll never have to pay attention to this if it's available, since it's always available, except maybe in solo play. Carlotta's Liberation is the bread and butter of her kit and is also the easiest part to use. It operates on a 25 seconds cooldown timer, which sets a hard limit on how fast her teams can operate. Just make sure you fully charge your Forte bar before casting it to grant your entire Liberation moveset an 80% final damage bonus. She cannot build any substance or molding crystals while her Liberation is active. Once you cast the initial hit, which provides an 18% defense ignore debuff, just spam 4 basic attacks and then a 5th for the final hit. Holding down a direction while attacking will do a big dodge that way before shooting for more maneuverability. Note that dodge countering in her ult forces her to use 2 normal gunshots before her next big hit, so try to not dodge if you can just eat the hit. Not much going on here, just damage. And again, make sure you double cast skill after her Liberation ends to make sure your future rotations are smoother. Do not swap off mid-Liberation because it will remove her 80% final damage buff. Carlotta's Resonant skill tree is her main way of burning molding crystals to generate substance. It has a 14 seconds cooldown by default, which can be reduced by 6 seconds with each full Forte bar heavy attack. The first skill is a simple 2-hit that grants 3 molding crystals and inflicts dispersion, a 1.5 seconds freeze that works on anything in the game, including bosses, whereas the second skill cast is a fancy aerial maneuver that deals big damage and also consumes all molding crystals present, converting each into 10 substance. Remember that you can only hold a maximum of 6 molding crystals at once. If you intro and then immediately double cast skill, you will have 90 substance. 30 from intro, 3 molding crystals from intro, 3 more from first skill cast, and all 6 converted into plus 60 substance on second skill cast. You're nearly ready to ult already. And this is why we want to always cast skill ×2 before ending a rotation, because it will cover the missing 30 substance we need. Alright, so Carlotta's basic attacks. In hard content with full teams, you will almost never use these. Normally you start the fight with a double Carlotta skill cast for 30 substance and swap off to your supports. By the time she intros, her skill should be off cooldown again, so you can easily hit 120 substance by casting skills again. Only in teams that have too fast an opener rotation for the skill to come off cooldown, you might use her normal heavy attack to produce 3 crystals and then basic 3 times at the very first rotation. You never need to do this on follow-up rotations. Therefore, the only time our basic attack tree sees extensive use is solo play and overworld. Level this up as you like, but it holds a very low priority. There are a lot of different moves here that look cool, but I'm just letting you know the average player will not be using much of this moveset, which is a shame honestly, because they look so well made. Carlotta's intro is literally just damage. The only reason it is important is because it grants 30 substance and 3 molding crystals. This has nothing to do with leveling the tree, so you don't have to invest into it much. Now, like Zhang, Carlotta has a true DPS outro, only dealing damage. However, she deals it all in a single hit, making it much easier to trigger and still be affected by all buffs. It also has a very high motion value at over 700%. Carlotta's inherent skills are quite important. The first loses value on Quickswap teams, but it's still useful. In a traditional Hypercarry play, the Hyper Armor and iframes during Chromatic Splendor are super important, because this is the move that burns your molding crystals into substance and it doesn't do so until the final hits. Getting interrupted here would break your entire rotation because you no longer have a way to quickly burn the crystals you generate, since it would go on a 14 seconds cooldown. Her second inherent skill is important for damage scaling. Normally, her 18% defense ignore debuff is only applied on her initial ult cast. It only lasts 4 seconds, and this means 2 things. Your entire pre-ult rotation, which actually does decent damage, will not benefit from this debuff. And your final ult hit, the biggest one, takes over 4 seconds to trigger, and thus would not benefit from this debuff. Having your second inherent skill guarantees the enemy is affected by deconstruction debuff the entire time Carlotta is on field. For minor notes, Camellia brings 12% attack and 8% crit rate. Comfy and easy to get consistent crits for damage, of which she already has a lot of. Echo set discussion time. There's really only one option. Her new Echo set, Frosty Resolve from Rinascita's 2.0 expansion. Why? Most elemental Echo sets grant 40% element on the 2-piece and 5-piece effects. How much does this new set grant? 70.5. She's also the only one that can trigger the double liberation cast for an extra 18% skill bonus. Yes, part of the set buff is skill damage, but here, look at her pie chart. She's roughly 85% skill damage, the highest damage weighting pie chart in the game. Even Jinhsi is only about 80% skill damage. This new Echo set is actually a good thing. While you need to regrind Echo sets for Carlotta, note that Kuro decided to shift more of her power into her Echo set instead of her signature weapon, and this means free-to-plays have more access to her power ceiling through a farming route instead of needing to swipe and pray on her weapon gacha. So how big is the gap? Well, I'm not even going to compare to the normal ice set for 2 simple reasons. First is that it is literally 30% more damage bonus, which is equal to roughly 10% more total damage output, which is a lot. Second is because to activate the old Glacio set 5-piece fully, Carlotta has to weave an extra basic attack in for the final stack, slowing down her rotations. This means it is at minimum 10% worse than the new Glacio set in all scenarios. And some of you might also be wondering how well Lingering Tunes compare, since it gives attack percent instead of damage percent, and Carlotta has absolutely no attack percent buffs on her mechanics anywhere. Well, the gap is still pretty bad. It's 10 to 15% worse. Don't do it. It's literally farm her new set or lose 10 to 15% of her damage no matter what weapon you're using. The new set is your best choice at making up for not having her signature and allows free-to-plays to get very good damage out of her. Per the usual expectations, double element 3 cost is once again the best choice for most weapons, with element attack coming slightly ahead on signature. However, something very interesting has happened. Because her new Echo set gives so much damage percent, it becomes such a diluted stat that it closes the gaps across builds. Glacio attack versus double Glacio are generally only 1 to 2% different, at most no matter what weapon you use. In the past, this freedom for building only happened if you used the Resonator's signature weapon. However, because this time, the massive damage percent is actually coming from the Echo set instead of a weapon, all weapons now have this flexibility on Carlotta to pick between Glacio attack or double Glacio, going with whichever one has better substats. Also, note that there is only one 4-cost new Glacio set echo, Sentry Construct. Like many new 2.0 echoes, this 4-cost grants passive stats, being 12% Glacio and 12% skill by just equipping it in the main slot, and no longer requires casting it to get the unique buffs. Because Carlotta's 85% skill damage, skill percent substat becomes more valuable than attack flat. It is still behind attack percent, especially because her new echo set will dilute damage percent more than usual. For energy economy, she requires 110 to 115 ER if you actually cast her Sentry Construct. If you do not cast it, since it is now optional as they passively grant buffs, she will need a 115 to 120 ER. In low energy generation teams, for example Lumi, a very bad battery but has strong skill amplifier outros, Carlotta will need up to 20 more ER than listed so far. This means 130 to 140 needed for a Carlotta with budget Lumi instead of Zhezhi. Carlotta actually has a lot of options for weapons. Her signature, The Last Dance, is clearly her best choice, leading by roughly 18% over Static Mist on the new Frosty Resolve set and 23% on Lingering Tunes. Remember that I do not recommend using Lingering Tunes with Carlotta, as her new set is 10 to 15% total damage ahead of all other sets for her. Static Mist only trails by 18% because, first, The Last Dance only grants 48% skill damage instead of the typical 60 that we're used to seeing in signatures. Furthermore, the Frosty Resolve Echo set with massive damage percent dilutes The Last Dance's passive further, whereas Static Mist never gave damage percent buffs to the equipped Resonator anyways. Finally, the 12.8% ER passive on Static Mist can be converted to an extra attack percent substat roll. Normally, Carlotta will want 2 ER rolls to be safe, while 1 ER rolls works if you always cast Sentry Construct and makes her very inflexible in team building options and would only work in a Zhezhi team. Outside of that, all of her other teams want her to be at 115 to 120 ER range. Coming behind the 5 stars is Thunderbolt, the Battle Pass weapon. This is essentially a budget signature of The Last Dance. It grants 21 skill damage at base, but requires 1 extra basic attack at the start of her rotation, and 69% skill damage at max refine. For a character that is so heavily weighted to skill damage, this is an excellent choice if you already have it. Otherwise, it is still only roughly comparable to Static Mist and does not have the free ER passive. For a more free-to-play friendly option, Undying Flame is by far the next best choice. It is not only the next strongest, but also one of the best for finding pistols besides the Battle Pass Thunderbolt with its abnormal scaling. The passive grants 20% skill damage on Undying Flame on intro for 15 seconds, which is enough to last her entire rotation easily, and also buffs nearly every single move she does. Otherwise, all the other weapons trail somewhat behind, and I would absolutely not recommend giving her Nova Burst. This weapon is literal garbage and actually almost worse than the 3-star pistol weapons on her. You waste time dodging and dashing to build the buffs, and you might even have to refresh it mid-rotation so it actually applies to her final biggest attack. The 12% attack buff is also rather small for needing multiple stacks to reach. Now, if you manage to achieve all that we've discussed so far, then her endgame substats should look a little bit like this. Do keep in mind these are scaled to level 90 with maxed out Forte, so it can take some time to reach this. Carlotta's sequences are pretty cool. They do not alter how she plays, so if you're already enjoying her style, then it's more of the same. Otherwise, some might find this news disappointing. They're quite strong and have similar distributions to Camellia's sequences. All math was done assuming R1 The Last Dance. Note that all values are quoted in vacuum and will be slightly diluted in full team comp rotations. Her main stopping points are S2, S3, and S6. S1 makes it so you have plus 12.5 crit rate when hitting an enemy with Deconstruction, the 18% defense ignore debuff. This sequence requires you to get her inherent skill so her entire kit can apply Deconstruction. If you can't get it yet, you will barely notice her S1 doing anything. It also grants an extra 30 points of substance when hitting frozen enemies with Chromatic Splendor, the fancy aerial second skill. This effect is only useful on the first rotation because you do not want to skip the skill cast after Liberation. It is a loss of DPS to do so. Or in other words, her S1 shaves 1 second at most off the very first rotation and first rotation only. It's still a decent S1, charting 9.6% higher damage than S0. Her S2 is just a fat multiplier to her final big Liberation hit, Fatal Finale, with a plus 126% motion value multiplier. This is a weaker S2 buff than Camellia's S2 because Ephemeral on her just hits much harder itself. Regardless, Carlotta's S2 is still big at a 21.5% more total damage than S1. It is 1.33 times as strong as S0. S3 is her first big break, granting an extra 1000% bonus outro hit. No, this does not replace her original hit, it's an extra outro hit, and this is not enough to make Lingering Tunes worth using on her. But it also nearly doubles her skill hits, Art of Violence and Chromatic Splendor, as well with a plus 93% motion value multiplier. Now, because you use these at the start and end of her rotation, it ends up being doubly effective. S3 is deceptively strong, charting 26% more total damage over S2, or 1.68 times as strong as S0. S4 is a rather minuscule buff that works best on a double DPS setup with other skill damage units such as Changli or Jinhsi. Casting Carlotta's normal heavy, full Forte heavy, or full Forte tinted crystal heavy will grant the entire team plus 25% skill damage for 30 seconds. Minor buff on her, but it's pretty useful because she deals mostly that, but it's just a 5.9% more damage than her S3. Remember, it is primarily a team buff. S4 is 1.78 times as strong as S0. S5 is bait, increasing our full Forte Tinted Crystal Heavy, Imminent Oblivion, with a 47% motion value multiplier. This is the weakest sequence on our kit, worth just a 3.4% increase over S4 and 1.84 times as strong as S0. Finally, her S6 is big like it should be, albeit simple. It simply just buffs the crap out of her death knell shots, the spammable 4x liberation basics. You get extra shards and extra motion value multipliers with a net value of a single action of death knell, carrying a plus 186.6% MV multiplier. Death Knell now gains further crowd control, proccing scattering per shot to freeze enemies as well for 1.5 seconds. Because you can't shoot every 1.2 seconds with Death Knell, the enemy is effectively frozen the entire duration and cannot fight back, making up for Carlotta's vulnerability windows during her ults. Her S6 is a 29.2% DPS increase over S5 and 2.37 times as strong as S0. Want to talk about Carlotta's rotations? She's pretty simple. The idea is to do whatever you need to fill her Forte bar, Forte heavy, then go into her liberation and explode enemies. And remember to skill times 2 before swapping off to set up your next rotation. Everything before her liberation can be quick swapped, and have quite generous windows exceeding 1 second easily. This makes her compatible in both dual DPS and Hypercarry comps. Note that there is no time during her own rotation to cast Sentry Construct, and is normally casted as a quick swap during other Resonator rotations. The uncharged version of Sentry Construct starts from the air and will force quick swaps into the air, whereas the charged version starts from the ground. Charged Sentry Construct is done by casting Carlotta's Liberation to enable a gauge over the Echo. Every attack grants 1/6 of a charge once per second. At full charge, the Echo cooldown resets and you can use the Enhanced Echo cast. Realistically, you never get the cooldown reset because Carlotta doesn't have a good window to cast it on first rotation, and only casts it out of rotation from second rotation onwards. The standard Carlotta rotation takes 12 seconds to perform with no cancels or swaps. On the very first rotation, you want to lead with a double skill cast, and swap off to produce 30 substance immediately while you're setting up your supports. By the time Carlotta hits the field with her intro, her skills should be off cooldown. If they're not, you will instead open with a heavy attack and 3 basic attacks for 30 substance. Regardless, once you intro her, you will want to immediately double skill. This move can be back swapped and has a 1.6 seconds leeway. Intro gives 30 substance and 3 molding crystals. Double skill will add 3 more molding crystals and immediately burn all 6 for plus 60. If you did the rotation properly, you have the extra 30 from the start or previous rotation, and you will now have a full Forte bar and can immediately aerial attack to land to cast Imminent Oblivion. Note that you cannot dodge cancel Imminent Oblivion for some reason, nor any of the liberation moves after. Imminent Oblivion is the last quick swap window allowed and carries a hefty 1.6 seconds leeway. Then, you cast Liberation and spam 4 basic death knells, then her second Liberation finale and double cast skill to outro. Make sure you don't outro until Chromatic Splendor triggers for the 30 substance, which is when she begins the upside down splits, and that's it. That's the Carlotta rotation. As a reminder, the in-depth version of Carlotta's team building will be in a separate video since it takes an enormous amount of time to get team data and rotations done. If you want an early peek, I already refined all team rotations in the Carlotta spreadsheet. Carlotta prefers Shorekeeper over Verina usually because she does not benefit much from double introing herself, which is what Verina would allow, and she's also restricted by her 25 seconds cooldown ult, which is her main source of damage. Shorekeeper teams will always parse about 15% ahead in clear times compared to Verina teams for Carlotta, outside of the Jinhsi double DPS variant. Team building for Carlotta is pretty simple. She is a Glacial DPS with 85% skilled damage. This means Zhezhi is literally a perfect pair for her and makes a simplistic Hypercarry comp. Alternatively, Lumi functions as the best budget option because her heavy attacks can hit from range. Do be careful as Lumi's ranged attacks drain stamina and Carlotta puts herself in the air, which also consumes stamina to land and continue her rotation. For dual DPS, because Carlotta only has 2 good backswap windows, with a third okay one, she prefers teammates that have their own backswap windows as well as shorter rotations. This makes Jinhsi and Changli really good partners for her, as well as Havoc Rover, whereas longer rotation teammates like Yao can be a bit awkward because of being forced to wait out Carlotta's entire ult animation since she cannot swap off during it. I would not recommend using Tao Chi with Carlotta because her melee nature and parries contrast with Carlotta's ranged playstyle with deft movement and can make things awkward in timing's inconsistency. Seriously, just use Lumi. She actually fits very well with Carlotta, and if you have Lumi's S1, you no longer need to pay attention to stamina at all. For a bit sneak peek, we'll do a quick showcase of the 2 most common and strongest Carlotta teams. Zhezhi Carlotta's first because it's so tailor-made and obvious. Carlotta inherently plays minor Quickswap because it allows her to charge her substance much more easily, rather than being a main source of increasing team DPS. With Shorekeeper, you basically interrupt her basic 3 because it takes too long. We swap cancel it to Carlotta to double skill cast for 30 substance. We also want to cast Zhezhi's ult early to push it up in the team rotation for faster damage. We can then basic 3 times on Zhezhi and swap cancel the last move as well as you can, because normally it takes too long to cast. We'll swap back to Shorekeeper to finish her rotation. Then we intro into Zhezhi, which will fill the rest of her Forte bar so she can immediately go skill, basic, skill times 3 to outro. If you're still using Heron, you will have to find a place to cast it comfortably. If you're using the new Empyrean set for coordinated damage, you can cast Hikati whenever you want. It is a passive just like Fallacy and has no cast animation. You can even cast it during intro, when you normally aren't allowed to take any other action. By now, you intro onto Carlotta, skill times 2 to max out your Forte bar and slam down to your imminent Oblivion heavy, then cast Liberation and go pew pew pew. Remember to skill times 2 and outro back onto Shorekeeper, and that's it. Now if you're playing the Verina version, you can double intro Zhezhi to make rotations smoother and safer. Note that this does not noticeably speed up the team, because Carlotta will still be restricted by her 25 seconds cooldown on her ult, but it does open up more leeway for mistakes and grants more iframes since you no longer need to rely on Zhezhi's basic attacks to produce Forte. Just basic attack until you can cast it. To play this team, you open again with Carlotta's 2x skill and set up Zhezhi's basic 1-2-3 and swap cancel to Verina. Remember, because of double intro later, you only have to judge a basic 1-2-3 on the very first rotation. Do Verina's rotation, then you would outro onto Zhezhi with a full Forte bar. She can immediately go into skill, basic, and then skill times 3 into her outro. And if you're still using Heron, you'll have to find a place to cast it comfortably, but if you're using the new Empyrean set for core damage, you can cast Hikati whenever you want, even during her intro. This team is slightly faster than Shorekeeper variant for introing Carlotta, meaning you might have 0.5 to 1 second left on Carlotta's skill cooldown when you bring her in. You can cast basics and then cast skill times 2 to max out her Forte bar and slam into imminent Oblivion. Do Liberation rotation to clean up in skill times 2 before you swap off to Zhezhi. Yes, Zhezhi, because Verina doesn't need her intro, and doing this is how we double intro Zhezhi for all future rotations so she no longer needs the basic attack. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching through this entire video. I hope this Carlotta guide has been useful for deciding on whether to pull on her banner. As a reminder, the future team building guide will be dropped over the next day or two covering all of other team variants and play styles. All spreadsheets documenting my testing can also be found in the description and pinned comment. Do feel free to make a copy if you want to change values and test stuff. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos. You won't miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be for this video. Thank you all for watching and see you all next time.